A graphic card is a component which renders the signals that are sent to the monitor or graphics and is responsible for generating all the text and pictures on your screen. It's called a graphics card because it can be inserted in a PCI slot on the motherboard. 2D or two-dimensional graphic, and the kind of graphic disappeared when you use a web browser, check email, or work on a spreadsheet. For 2D graphics, the major factors and resolution and refresh LED resolution determines how many little dots are used to draw the image on the screen, which called as pixels. For example, 614 to 480 means that the whole screen is drawn using 307,200 little dots and 640 columns and 480 rows. The more dots that are used, the final detail, and refresh rate refers to how many times per second the image on the screen is redrawn. 60 Hz means that the image on the screen is drawn 60 times every second. This becomes important in a fast-moving video game where the action needs to look you 3D or three-dimensional graphics are used mostly by first-person shooter type if games. Of course, current monitor technology still only really displays a 2D image, but the player is immersed in a landscape where they can move their character's head and see objects in all directions and move around within this world. This type of display capabilities require some pretty intense mathematical calculations to be done very fast. The value of a good 3D graphics card is that it offloads most of this work from computer screen processor, and a specialized processor on the graphic card handles these calculations. This allows for faster, later-looking graphics. Also, newest reading cards handles all kinds of additional functions that give surface texture, makes water transparent, etc. So basically, a graphic card will handle all the display work and keep the processor free to perform other like big jobs.
To a brief history of graphics cards. In 1981, IBM released what many consider to be the first video card ever, the monochrome display adapter. While it wasn't capable of generating real graphics, it nonetheless fulfilled the purpose of displaying video. It only had 4 kilobytes of video memory and could only output the color green on a black background. In addition to that, it was only capable of printing ASCII characters and representing 80 columns and 25 lines on the screen. In 1983, Intel released the ISBX 275 video graphics multi-mode board. It cost $1,000 and was capable of displaying 8 unique colors at a resolution of 256 by 256. Having 32 kilobytes of memory, it was capable of drawing lines, circles, arcs, rectangles, and character bitmaps. At that time, it was considered revolutionary. In 1988, ATI, which would be bought by AMD or Advanced Micro Devices in 2006, released the VGA Wonder. It was a 16-bit fully 2D video card with a mouse port configured directly into the card. It also had an analog and digital video connector, allowing different types of PC monitors to be connected. The VGA Wonder, along with many variants of ATI's Wonder and Mac cards, put ATI at the forefront throughout the formative days of the PC. In 1996, 3DFX's Voodoo 1 was released. It stayed clear of 2D graphics, which forced users to run a 2D card alongside it. But that didn't matter. It was the age when people clamored for hardware that could keep up with the 3D graphics in games such as Doom and Quake. With 4 MB of RAM and a 50 MHz core, the Voodoo 1 became a massive hit, claiming market share faster than it takes shit to go out your ass. Nvidia, as big as they are today, made their first entry into the market in 1996 with the NV1, partnering with Sega. It featured a disappointing audio component, a 2D card, a 3D accelerator, a port for Sega Saturn game controllers, and employed quadratic surfaces rather than triangular ones. DirectX, which came out just after the NV1 was released, used polygons instead of quadratic texture mapping, and so long-term, the NV1 failed. The next year, Nvidia released the Riva 128. Fun fact, Riva stands for Real-Time Interactive Video and Animation Accelerator. It got rid of the quadratic surfaces, the underwhelming audio component, and cut ties with Sega. It initially didn't do well, but upon the rollout of upgraded drivers, it performed much better. Not as good as the Voodoo though, but the Riva 128 righted the ship and put Nvidia on a favorable course. There were actually 2 versions of the Riva 128 and the Riva 128ZX. They only slightly differed, as can be seen. Known to some as the last great product from 3DFX, the Voodoo 2 was released in 1998. The Voodoo 2 introduced scanline interleave, or SLI, which enabled two cards to work in parallel in a single computer. NVIDIA would later reintroduce SLI in their graphics card in 2004, though the acronym now stands for Scalable Link Interface. By the late 1990s, due to questionable corporate moves and poor design decisions, 3DFX began its rapid decline. It was eventually acquired by NVIDIA for intellectual property rights before declaring bankruptcy in 2002. The beginning of the modern GPU arrived in 1999 with the release of NVIDIA's GeForce 256. Fun fact, NVIDIA actually coined the term GPU or Graphics Processing Unit. The GeForce 256 was the first 3D accelerator to fully support DirectX 7 and was capable of processing a minimum of 10 million polygons per second. The 256 performed triangular calculations on the graphics card instead of the CPU. Because the graphics card had approximately 4 times the power of a high-end CPU at that time, there was considerable gain in certain cases from performing the calculations on the graphics card itself. The 256 was also the first card to use DDR SD-RAM. At the same time, ATI released the Rage Fury Max, its first dual GPU card. Using 2 processing engines and alternate frame rendering to almost double performance, it featured 64 MB of onboard memory, which was considered massive at that time. However, it was held back by a lack of hardware-based transform and lighting, a feature that was on NVIDIA's GeForce 256. At the turn of the century, the graphics industry slowly became a battle between two giants, NVIDIA and ATI/AMD. In 2002, ATI released the Radeon 9700 Pro. At the time of its arrival, it was considered to be the fastest card around. It was also the first to come with a full DirectX 9 feature set. It was one of the largest and most complex GPUs during its time with 110 million transistors. And then in 2004, NVIDIA released the GeForce 6800. It was the first card to support NVIDIA's SLI or Scalable Link Interface technology, which again allowed 2 compatible cards to work together in a single system to deliver increased performance. With a whole host of other features, the 6800 was the card to beat. 2 years later, in 2006, NVIDIA released the GeForce 8800 GTX. It was one of the first GPUs to support CUDA or Compute Unified Device Architecture. It also offered DirectX 10 compatibility out of the box. It brought a massive leap in performance over DirectX 9 cards during its time. In some cases, it even almost doubled the performance. In 2008, ATI, now AMD, released the Radeon HD 4870X2. With a 750 MHz core and 2 1GB 900 MHz RAM, the HD 4870X2 became the single fastest card on the market. Its drawbacks, namely being hot, heavy, and expensive, were easily forgotten once people saw what it could do. The next year, AMD unveiled the ATI Radeon 5970 as the world's fastest graphics card, which turned the tide in AMD's favor. In addition to packing 4,640 gigaflops of computing power, it was the first ATI card to support AMD's Eyefinity setup, which allowed 3 independent display controllers to drive 3 displays simultaneously. 3 years later, in 2012, NVIDIA released the GTX 680. It arrived in March of 2012 as the world's fastest GPU. The GTX 680 also debuted NVIDIA's brand new architecture, Kepler. It featured NVIDIA GPU Boost, Adaptive Vertical Sync, NVIDIA Surround, and 2 anti-aliasing modes, FXAA and TXAA. And in 2013, NVIDIA released the Titan, a graphics card we've all come to be familiar with. The Titan was easily the fastest single GPU on the market. The Titan was a beast of a graphics card, but it came with a price tag of $1,000. NVIDIA would release a follow-up to the Titan in 2015 with the Titan X. The Titan X was a monster of a graphics card, but it came with a price tag of $1,050. In the same year, AMD released the Radeon R9 Fury X to combat NVIDIA's GTX 980 Ti graphics card. And fast forward to today, in the year 2016, we now have NVIDIA's GTX 1080 and 1070. And very recently, NVIDIA released the GTX 1060 to combat AMD's $200 Radeon RX 480 as the battle for graphics card supremacy continues.